Hello and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this third session of Inspiring Conversations. And just a reminder, inspiring conversation, we can be talking about whatever, but making conversation that really matter. And when you have been listening to two interesting people, I hope, then maybe you will get something, take something with you. You will build moments, and you maybe learn something that you can say, "Oh, this I can use in my life." So I hope, and I think that my guest today will be very, very interesting because we have been on a podcast and a live stream before, or almost like a podcast, live podcast. And it's David Bellamy. Yay! So, Mr. David, no, Mr. Bellamy, not whatsoever related to the national team coach of Wales, are you?
Craig Bellamy, no.
No. Okay, so that's off. Then let's start with you introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are as my guest today.
Oh,
Isn't
wow.
isn't that a nice thing? Like, you have to tell me why you are a guest today.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. Thank you for inviting me on. I came along to your conversation last week with Tony, and I thought it was incredible. Really interesting and inspiring conversation. So that was fab. But yeah, I'm David Bellamy. So my background, I spent a fair bit of time as a management consultant, and I guess the older I got, the more experienced I got, the more I sort of came to realize that most of what goes on in organizations, the things that you bring consultants in to sort of try and help with, is actually people related, and it's maybe the thing you don't need consultants for, but it was the stuff you're doing, the projects, the change that's going on in organizations just became sort of more interesting. The fact that, the whole culture and people thing is what really matters. I think most people, by the way, as we get older, we sort of tend to arrive at that. When we're younger, it's about the task, it's about doing things, and then the older we get, the more we realize it's all about people.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the journey I was on, and 7 years ago was in my own consulting firm at the time, doing work. If you remember the Jim Collins Good to Great type work, or book, but we were doing work a bit like that, and I look at it and very fondly and favorably in terms of, we were doing interesting stuff. It was quite formulaic as I look back on it. We'd take executives away into sort of retreats and work on purpose and values and stuff like that. But there was a particular thing we did, which was around culture, where we would ask them like a three-part exercise. Three parts exercise where you'd start with the kind of, if your culture could be anything at all, if it could be perfect, what would it be? What would it be like here? And so in pictures and words, these guys and these leadership teams would go off and they'd come up with these amazing organizations, and part two was, okay, so what's it like today? And obviously we're trying to create this sense of gap, and you would get a gap, right? You'd get the slightly less shiny version. But the kicker was that we would then say, oh, by the way, sorry, we've been and spoken to your people, and this is what they say it's like to work here. And then the fighting started. Always. It was just a very interesting thing. And that really sort of got my attention, because everywhere you work, this sort of gulf between what people want their culture to be like, what they think it is, and what people say it is, were sort of miles apart. And so that's where, so you know me, of course, through my journey with Happiness Lab into Harken. That's where that started, because I suddenly thought, okay, well, we don't really understand what's happening inside organizations. People at the top of the organization don't know what it's like inside, what it's like for people. And that leads us really neatly, doesn't it, to this conversation today about why listening is hard, because actually that's the bridge.
Yeah. Well, the theme is listening is hard, but it is worth it. And as we say in the blue line there, true listening isn't easy. It challenges us to pause, be present, and embrace discomfort. Yet it is in these moments of effort that listening becomes transformative. But when back in like 7 years ago, when you realized this, is it what was your initial thoughts? Was it because or when you were talking about this, were they afraid of realizing that there was some gap, or like what how did you realize that there was a potential in the market, like there was a gap in the market for like a platform or something to figure out what is the people saying, what are the employees saying?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So there was absolutely no sense of fear in any of the people that we were
okay,
talking to
yeah,
about the idea of hearing. What's I mean, you got to go back and you have to think about the mechanisms that people relied on. So back then, I mean, everybody we worked used an annual survey,
yeah,
and of course, then that's not the only way people listen. Of course, so you go pre-pandemic. So people would walk around the office. They would have their breakfast meetings with their people and stuff like that. We make sense of things as leaders in lots and lots of different ways, and all of that constitutes forms of listening, right? So the big gap that they had was really in trusting this sort of feedback mechanism, the formalized feedback mechanism, which was annualized survey. Everybody we spoke to about that said, "Do you know what? But I don't really trust it." Of course, because by the time I get it, it's out of date and all that sort of stuff. But I want to just stress, of course, the world's moved on from there, and so most of these organisations would move on eventually, of course, and do pulse type surveys. But for me, the thing that got my attention and the gap that I observed remained, right? Which is, we don't really have any mechanisms to connect day-to-day life inside an organization, the sort of day-to-day experience back into, so there's no way of really picking that up, and that's
mm,
really got worse, hasn't it? Because as we move through 2020, the pandemic years, and into a more flexible way of working, we're seeing cultures that are sort of atomizing somewhat. They're sort of spreading and difficult for people to really pick up the senses of what's happening on the ground. And the reason I talk about it in those terms, by the way, so is that the individualized threads of experience, the ups and downs that we all have, when you join all that together, that is your morale, right? So morale, and so things affect us all, but in aggregate, that's morale of the organization. So we can all have bad days and things going on in our personal lives, but I carry that into my work. But they tend, the ups and downs of normal life tend to blend together, or they sort of smooth themselves out in a population. The things that tend to move the dial affect lots of people at the same time. Things we see inside organizations. I'll just take one step back again. Sorry, but when we think about how I approached what I thought the issue was. So I started with the idea that actually the problem was people didn't have any mechanism to hear what was going on the ground. And I've come to realize it's more than that. So I was initially, and you probably remember this from the very early conversations we would have had, very sort of the surveys are part of the problem, not part of the solution, in my opinion. But that's only part of it, because I think that the listening part, you can't talk about listening without talking about what people are prepared to tell you. Can't talk about these things without understanding that the rules inside organizations, they're often unspoken rules, determine what filters through, what we're prepared to share. And so all of that means we end up with an incomplete picture. And so the sense that leaders have of what's really happening inside their organization is often governed by a whole load of other things. It's a very it's a multifaceted challenge. And it's just one that I think if we can crack, if organizations can really lean into the discomfort that, of course, you refer to in your sort of subheading, if we can embrace the discomfort, then what will come from that, I think, are organizations that are more trusting, more open, and places where people can contribute differently than they do today.
That maybe brings us to the question that Rab Bassi is asking, like, were those annual surveys about the company, by the company, useful? Because we have spoken a lot about the annual surveys, where you answered and then they worked it, and then it was red and green and yellow, or some improvements here and some, but it was always like a little too late. Either it was 3 months late or it was 6 months late. Like it took time to go through all the stuff. So they were useful in one sense. Or how would you answer Rab, like with this because of the surveys?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think they were useful. They remain useful to a point, but but it's more than the issue. I think this is my sort of beef with the industry, right? So like I did, and I talked about a moment ago, you focus on the speed elements, right? So we think about, well, they're too slow. They don't tell us enough, and so technology comes along, and we see, how many thousand companies are there out there offering surveys and technologies, and they all offer instant or semi-instant responses to surveys, etc. But I think actually the question is, what are we learning from that? So are they useful is a really good question. So regardless of who provides it, I mean, I would say that most companies are smart enough to know that you externalize the provision of a survey like that because it adds some further integrity, it adds some further protection around things like anonymity or at least confidentiality that makes it a bit safer. But we're still only asking the things that the company thinks or the survey provider thinks you should know. So we end up with this sort of voice thing that says, look, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? And so we've got a list of things that I'm going to talk about, but there's never been a survey, and I'm pretty certain, I'm Peakon or Culturamp, anybody please correct me on this if you if you come across this video. There's never been a survey question that says, does your laptop fire up properly in the morning? Do the services that we're using to connect us and to help us do our work, are they functioning properly? So the distinction, I think, in the way we have to try to tune into employee voice is by starting to think, okay, what does real life actually look like? Right? It doesn't really take into account things like, actually, do you know what? Most of our systems are clunky. How many times you want to call with a call center somewhere and they're saying, sorry, systems are going really slowly today. I'm sorry, I've got to, can't answer that question. I can't access that right now. These are the bits of grit that get in the way. And of course, when you think you open up to employee voice and day-to-day experience, what matters to people is not, what do you think of the communication? What do you think of our purpose? What do you think of our strategy? Day-to-day stuff. And they're all important. But there's a lens here that we're missing, which says what's important to the employees right now. And again, I'll come back to the point I made before. So you get this sort of sense of the grit in the organization at one level. And then, of course, if you move yourself into what most organizations experience with increasing regularity right now, which is significant and wide-ranging change, big implementations of technology, restructures, job, so the sort of organizational redesigns and things that people face all the time, well, that brings about a whole different set of things. And what happens in those instances, people start to share their concerns and their fears. And of course, naturally, as I said before, that impacts morale. And morale, of course, holds it all together, right? So and when you watch this, and I think this is where I've become particularly interested, the idea that actually, can we make sense of an organization through the lens of how our people feel? And can we get greater clarity about that sense-making process, if you like, by understanding what sorts of things are getting in the way, what sort of things are working, what are they loving right now? And then you get a truer picture of life inside a business.
But when you say, when I think back to my own career, and if like the leaders were walking around and saying hello, and like, but would I have been honest? Like, would a employee be honest to say, like, oh, hi, how are you? And you would say, well, I'm fine. But literally in my gut, I was just like, I was having a marital problems, or my mother was dying, or like whatever. Like, but you didn't say it because you didn't think it would be relevant, or like how am my feelings, or how my life situation affect my work, or like how, what does the leader or the like want to hear? Because and it's just, back in the days when we were younger, you didn't say anything because you were afraid of losing your job, or saying like, why are you so difficult? If you raised your voice and said, I'm not entirely like, I don't agree with you. What about this and this? But then they would drag up the I went to university card or whatever. Like it's just like, how did you sense, when in your beginning, like did you sense that people were screaming or shouting out for, I need something? Because as bad COVID was, then something shifted, because we and leaders and everybody was starting to like, how are you? How are you doing? You are alone at home. They started to ask questions that were relevant
Yeah.
about the whole picture, not just, okay, here you are, get going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, I think there were lots of perversely good things, weren't there, that came out of that period. And you're right to think about how it was in days gone by. But I think there's a sort of naivety, isn't there, in the understanding or the belief that, as Rab puts it, there was a time when you were told to leave your personal life at home. Right? You put your suit
Yeah.
on in the morning and you stopped being David, and you went to work and you were David in the office, kind of thing. And but you can't, I think the thing that we've all come to understand and realize is that it makes no sense, but it also isn't really possible. That whether bringing myself to work in a way that I can show up is reflective of how I'm feeling. Right? I've got lots of stuff on my mind. If my mother's poorly, my kids are struggling, I've got some financial worries that I haven't told anybody about, I'm carrying all that stuff, and that's just the nature. This is part of the complex web of things that as a leader we have to be mindful of, right? Because it's not your responsibility for those things, but that's happening inside your organization. It will affect how people show up, how they behave. It certainly impact how they perform. And that's back to the point I was making. So you can assume in any population that people have got personal stuff going on and others won't. Others are pretty focused on what they're doing and, able to really be there. And that evens itself out. But the question, and that's again right at the heart of the stuff we think a lot about at Harken is, do you care? Do you care enough about your people? Right. So what helps us to build trust? You talked in again in your piece about inspiring conversations. Building trust is a really important thing, and trust between an organization and its people is largely made up of feeling cared for. I mean, 84%, according to Paul Zak. And when you think about that for a moment, do I feel cared for as a human being? And then go to the point you made about when you go to the point you made about COVID. What happened? Right? We looked into people's bedrooms. We saw the context in which they were living. We cared that little bit more about working mums because suddenly we weren't rolling our eyes at them leaving the building 5 minutes early to pick up the kids or any of those sorts of things. We suddenly realized that people were having to deal with life in and around the work we're doing. Now, and that was interesting because we suddenly got interested in well-being. We suddenly got interested in the whole person and what they bring to work. But I tell you what, haven't we forgotten? We had a call last night. We did one of the Harken Academy events, and we were discussing this. Sort of wartime leadership that happened through COVID. Yeah. CEOs coming out and running events. Now, people are still working at home, but we're not really doing so much to connect anymore. We're not putting on those. Now, of course, everybody was at home. It's a slightly different context, but the amount of effort that went in to keep up morale, to keep up, people's spirits, make you feel like you are part of something, even though, we can forget those organizations who laid off all of their staff on the first day because they were shedding costs. But think about those the amount of effort that went into the others. And we've sort of forgotten that a bit, despite the fact that people are still at home. So I'm just picking up one of Rab's comments here because it popped up and I want to say, why is it hard to listen? Is it critique? is it not accepted well, or comfort to share, or let's say, or something else. But sorry, can I just pick that up?
Yeah, of course. Yes, yes, yes.
Hard to listen. It comes back to the point I touched on a moment ago, which is that, listening and speaking up are closely tied together. You can't really disentangle them too easily. I think the things that get in the way of us really hearing what matters inside organizations, you take aside the mechanisms for a minute. The things that stop us from hearing, firstly, there is what people are prepared to say, right? So we all know this, right? That there are lots of things that we're uncertain about saying, right? Great. I read a great article recently where, again, it was on this subject. Think about the questions or the things that you still can't say at work. And you've touched on a couple already, right? So I don't like the strategy, right? I don't think this is going to work. I have a different view, all that sort of stuff. Become things that we don't really talk about very openly. And there might be lots and lots of others. But there's a really good one, though, that falls into this camp, which is, I'm struggling right now, right? I'm right on the edge of my personal threshold. My resources are depleted. However you want to say that, I'm struggling, right? Now, organizations care more than they used to. They say they care more than they used to, right? And I believe that they do. So we have EAPs and we have all those sorts of things in the background, lots of support for people. But the fact remains that most people are still only prepared to put their hands up and tell you that they're struggling when they are prepared for consequences. And there are always consequences. They're no longer, it used to be that, and again, sort of Rab in the audience, sort of talking about, how things used to be. Well, there was a time we used to fear getting walked off the premises, right? I don't think that happens anymore, but we certainly know, and I think this is true, the organization will protect itself in the sense that, well, you'll get moved off that project you're on, we'll start to, allocate you slightly different work. And of course, I'm thinking about the sort of work that I do, but you can't go to that meeting, you can't do that. There are consequences, right? And we still fear the implications and the judgment that comes with it. And that's the same with lots of other things, right? So can I say this? And it isn't just, by the way, a question of psychological safety in terms of, am I going to get in trouble? But humans are deeply social creatures, right? And I have a view about something that we're doing, or I'm spotting some behaviors, and I don't really want to say anything because I can't be sure. B, I might embarrass somebody, and that won't be very good. I don't want to get them in trouble, but I don't want to embarrass them either. I don't want to create a situation, and so we tend to self-censor, right? So that's the sort of first thing, that what people are prepared to say. The second thing, then, of course, and back to Rab's question, is there's a whole bunch of other things that happen. So let's assume that comes to me. So it makes it through layers of organization, and everybody's censoring all the way up for lots of reasons. And then it gets to my ears as a CEO. What am I doing? Well, I don't have that experience. When I walk around the building, I don't sense that people are struggling. I don't sense that there's problems. And why? So is this true? So you will start to question the sort of veracity of the message that's coming up. And of course, that's wrapped up tightly in confirmation bias. And any CEO that I've ever spoken to, or has ever spoken to me, will know that, I'm pretty open about the fact that when you move around the building as a CEO, it behaves differently than it does when everybody else, right? When everybody else moves around, it doesn't sort of fall into place in quite the same way. And that's just a natural part of sort of social structures and hierarchy. Yeah. So the confirmation bias thing is really important. I think there's a secondary part, which is really interesting, about sort of attribution bias. So people find this very hard to say, well, who's that coming from? That person's, it's just David in accounts, right? He's always bloody moaning. He's always got an opinion that's counter everybody else's. So we teach ourselves to tune it out because of the source, and of course, and that reinforces many of the things that we already fear about speaking up. What happens when I say something that is not the norm, when it's out of the sort of standardly held views? So we end up silencing our own audience. And I think the other thing, the crux of the issue, why is it hard to listen? Because if you take aside leaders who don't care and then think about the ones that do, well, they're human beings doing a job, trying to do that the best they can. And of course, the biggest thing that they're trying to get right, should be trying to get right, is their job is to create the conditions in which others can do good work, right? So that's, now imagine that you're hearing that your people are really suffering with burnout or excessive workloads, or that the systems aren't working and customers are all shouting and screaming at you. Well, suddenly that can feel deeply personal. Right, and my role and myself become entirely intertwined and sort of, you know, difficult to separate. I'm doing all the things I can. I'm creating the environment that I think is supposed to help us do good work, and somehow I'm getting it wrong. And that then can become another way that we can seek to silence, hush, or dismiss. Right, that there's a whole bunch of things in here that really prevent us from tuning in. And if you go back then also, by the way, to take aside some, again, examples of corporate malfeasance, there are a shed load of examples that we put onto leadership, of course, as failings, where the signals didn't get through. You know, we knew there was a problem and it didn't make it to the top, or we silenced it. And there were some bad examples with them. But even if you sort of, you know, if we ever really understood what was going on, I suspect the things I've talked about are all in there. You know, the sort of difficulty that people have speaking up, the risk to self, the risk of embarrassment. You know, the truth tends to emerge over time, doesn't it? The sort of real picture. But as we try to make sense of the world that we're going, you know, it makes a lot more sense to me to try to embrace as much, you know, open feedback from employees as we possibly can. And the reason I say it's hard is not only because it is difficult, but it is uncomfortable. You know, that when you do things like restructure a company, you will hear that you have upset, hurt, made, you know, frightened far more people than you possibly imagine. You get rid of 1% of your workforce, 100% of your workforce will feel that. Right? They will fear for lots of things for themselves. They will be worried about their colleagues. They will be worried about the work will get done. They will question the future of the organization. And when you open yourself up to feedback from employees, you'll hear and feel that. But you cannot drive a ship, steer a ship, pilot a ship, whatever the right expression is, if you don't have the right information, right? And so my sort of counsel to anybody is that, you know, we absolutely must open our ears in more than if you like, to open ourselves up to hear more of what matters.
Yeah, but sometimes, like listening, if you take it, and it's complex and important, and like it's not just about hearing the words. And when you're talking about the one employee who shouts the most, or like is always ready, firing away, but you have a range of employers who, there is the silent ones or the introverts or the extrovert and stuff. So I know listening is hard, but could we say that it's equally hard to say your opinion, like, and give permission, like when you walk up to, I walk up to you as my leader and say, or I say, how are you, David? And you say, oh, I'm fine. How's the work? Oh, fine. But you know that you could say stuff, but you know, I could, yes, then he takes it as a critique, or I will take it blah, or worse, or he will fire me. Like, how can we integrate telling and listening so it will be not like, or maybe you did that in your quest, like it is this thing about, of course you want to be anonymous, maybe you don't want to, like, as you say, some people are afraid of rattling the cage, isn't it? Because, oh, I don't know what I will do, or what will happen, or it will all crumble, and so it's more complex. It's not just listening, it's also, you have to learn to say things.
Yep. Yeah, and you're making a really, really important point. I think the first part of our journey was building technology that created conditions and an environment in which people could speak more freely. So that's not the same as with impunity. It's not total free speech. This is in a workplace. It's a professional context. But can they speak more freely, right? So, and Rab, asked a great question, which is absolutely related to the thing you've just described as well, right? Which is, part of our quest was to say, can we normalize sharing our experience, good, bad, indifferent, right? And we have a gateway to that, which gives us data, which is really important, right? So how are you feeling right now, right? So that gives us our morale data. We've got some clever ways of turning that into meaningful numbers that take account for population types. And the second part then is why you're feeling that way, right? And so then normalizing that as a sort of routine, part of a habit of what we do at work, which is I just take 30 seconds every day just to feed into the organizational sort of sense-making capabilities, what's going on for me. Because in that round, what we do is we're starting to say, okay, well, we can see what's normal, we can see what's great, and we can see what's not great. Because it's then not, and it's part of another really important thing as well, which is that we often talk about, even language is really important here, isn't it? When you think about speaking up, speaking out, right? What is it? It's a call to action associated with something bad, and it's going in a particular direction, right? Speaking out is calling out, addressing. Speaking up is talking up to it. But there's a different thing that we must do, right? Which is when we try to normalize this dialogue. Well, actually, I'm not always talking to leadership, right? What I'm trying to do is share my experience. And if we actually make that transparent and accessible to everybody and then make it dialogue, which is all the stuff that we've done, then you're starting to get to a point where you're saying, okay, this is peer to peer. It's about understanding things, because then suddenly I'm describing something that I'm experiencing, and I always use a rather sort of facile example, but it sort of also falls quite comfortably with the stuff that you might have seen in the survey. But just imagine somebody using our product, Tarkan, and checking it and said, you know what, I'm really fed up today because I think communication in our company sucks. Right? I wish I knew more about, or I don't know anything about the strategy. Right? The only thing, rarely do we think about these things until somebody sends us a survey and asks us that question. But in reality, something may have happened and caused me to post that. Now, as I would describe it in a sort of survey, how do you feel about the communication? I think it sucks. Tick box gone, and then I've got a score in the bad box, right? But if you express that as a sort of normalized, today I'm struggling because I'm feeling like I don't understand enough about what's going on. I mean, communication sucks around here. What will happen is a couple of people might agree, say, you know what, I also wish I knew more about this, right? But you'll also see your colleagues coming in and saying, well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Do you not get the CEO email every Friday, or the voice message, or the video call? Do you see the intranet that's got the updates every day? And there's a feed you can take straight into your dashboard. There's Teams channels associated with comms, and you realize, and people will often respond to that by saying, do you know what, I didn't notice those things, or I've tuned a lot of that stuff out. It's the thing that's you're really trying to sort of embrace is the idea that we can talk about our experiences at work in a peer-to-peer way. So that suddenly changes the way we're able to make sense of what's really happening, because it's then different, isn't it? It's not the same as, when you ask, CEO asks you how you're feeling today, and you say, well, I'm okay, thanks. Now it could be a lack of psychological safety that says I won't tell them that I've got, I'm waiting for a doctor's appointment, or my wife's got a diagnosis on something that we're waiting to hear, or I won't tell them that my kid's poorly, or in fact that I'm terrified about the future of the organization. There's a load of things. Now, it's not psychological safety that prevents me from doing that. I don't want to bother him or her with that feedback, right? They've asked me a nicety, a social interaction, and something different is a sort of natural response, if that makes sense. So I'm just saying, yeah, of course I'm fine. And that's so we otherwise we're trying to change the whole of society up. We must change, and suddenly we'll stop asking how people feel, because I'm going to be spending my entire time trying to get to my office to get my job done. But I think the crux of this sort of how we make it okay to speak is by changing the way we think about it, because what we're trying to do is get information about real life out into an organization, and what you do with that, of course, again, is multifaceted, because what you see is that you've got people you trained as mental health first aiders, right? And well, let them lean into the people who are struggling, who are telling you that they're struggling. Let them be the first port of call, and then decide what's to happen. You've got people who are saying communication sucks. Well, let your comms team respond to that and say, what do you mean? What do you need? What's lacking? When they're worried about the future of something, well, let your transformation team come and talk about it. And all these things, by the way, can happen really naturally. But it starts for us, of course, and the thing that is crucial is that protecting identity, so that we start to equalize voice, and that becomes a really important component of the way that we think organizations should be thinking about listening. So yes, you can walk around the building. Yes, you've got Teams channels, you've got Slack, but actually when we can normalize the way people are able to express their experiences and then explore around that, I think you get a different place. And we know that, I mean, anybody that's ever used Harken would tell you, you hear stuff that you would not hear from anywhere else. And that becomes valuable, right? And because we use that gateway check-in data, we also have, I think the most remarkable capability to pinpoint morale in an organization in a way that makes it feel like it's real. If that makes sense, it follows exactly the patterns you would imagine. You make people redundant, you'll see morale drop. If when you cancel the Christmas party, you'll see morale drop. And of course, so this is, and our session last night that I alluded to earlier on was all about, what would happen if you could see the change curve that we know theoretically. If you could see that emerging in real time, how would it change the way you lead? Because suddenly you're able to actually anticipate things that are coming. So we could predict most of the ways that organizations will respond to certain situations. But the fact is, we under communicate most stuff, right? We don't prepare people for it. We don't lean into care enough. We don't support them through the journey. And so the theoretical models all lend themselves to uniformity and stuff. And we know that humans aren't like that. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there.
Yeah. But how is it, David? Like, if now we both are 29 with some decades on our back. You have been working like your whole life. And when comparing the certain stages in your work life, like, can you see where you, like when you were younger, were you listening to somebody like, or how has your journey been? Because yes, we get older, we get wiser and all of that, like Rab said at some point. But how is it today that are new leaders any different from the old times, or like, how do you see it? Because you are touching base, like both from your own personal life or professional life, and then where you are talking to leaders and saying, are you listening to your people? Are you hearing what they are saying? Do you realize that when you keep them in the dark, that they get anxious? They know there is something brewing, but they can't talk about it, and there is no, don't speak about it. And then it is maybe a birthday party or like, and it was nothing to be worried about. But if you don't tell them, or like, how do you know the interaction I'm talking about? Like,
I think so. I think when you look at, let's start with the first part of what you were describing, if I may. So what's different? Well, I think context is wildly different today than it was even 10 years ago. But as you say, I've been working a long time, not quite so old as to have been working. I wasn't up chimneys when I was 5 or anything like that. But I'm old enough to have been around. Certainly, when I started work, and one of the biggest transitions was moving from paper-based communication to emails. Right, that's how old I am. Right, email didn't exist before I started work. We used to have paper files for things, and you'd get memos appear in an inbox. What happened when we got email? Everything suddenly got urgent. Right, you used to get a bunch of communication come in your inbox. You would work through it from top to bottom. It would be chronological. You'd work through the stuff that came in first, and you deal with that in a reasonably sort of sensible order. And suddenly, what happened with email is things sped up. And so that's a big change, right? That changes the way people feel at work. It puts them under constant pressure. Now we are now in a position where we can largely forget about that as an innovation because it's just part and parcel of the way we work. But then you go forward and say, well, what else has changed? Well, we've gone from a time when actually I wrote about this recently, sort of liminal space, which is often liminal space is the space between things, right? Now, of course, we might be thinking about just pauses or gaps, but you think about a liminal space as communal space for a moment in offices where you used the coffee machine, and this is sort of almost a meme or a trope now, isn't it? The idea of culture happens at the coffee machine or the water cooler, but actually there is some truth to that, because we sit around and we get to just have a moment around the kettle, or around the coffee machine or whatever it might be, talking and connecting with people, and the after work socials that would be much, again, forget the organized fun, but just the going, I'm in the office, I'm going to finish 20 minutes early, I've got an hour to kill before I need to be back. Do you fancy a quick half in the pub, that sort of thing? And again, it's not to say that's the only way we can do things, but these are ways that connections, relationships, bonds were formed, right? And that gave us a connection to the people that we work with in a different way. And I just look at organizations that we work with today, and we start meetings on Teams and people arrive on the minute, and they're almost always back to back. Sorry, this is the 7th call I've had today, and they're straight on. There's very little time for niceties. You're straight into a sort of the dialogue. People are running off to the next call at the end, and little things about the way that we interact with one another, the social interaction. Humor's gone because we can't really, those little natural sort of quips and things that you might see in a natural interaction don't work because people feel silenced when there's 10 cameras on the screen and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of things like that going on at work that make life more complex for us to navigate. McKinsey research shows an organization with continuous listening should report a 25% reduction in turnover and 30% increase in employee engagement. Let me tell you a story. So I reached out to the people that wrote that report, right? Continuous listening. So that's a really good point. I spoke to some of the people at McKinsey, and so they've done this great work and they've explored the idea of continuous listening and how it works, and they built some technology for themselves that is like a baby version of Harken, and but pretty cool stuff, right? And then they went on to say, it's really interesting. So you look at the adoption thing, right? And what happens when we listen. So they do the all company survey, right? Which is a traditional mechanism. Everybody, we talked about it already. And the team that created this, the continuous listening, the open listening thing, right? So gave their feedback about how they were feeling about work and stuff in the way they did. And then they had called into a meeting where their boss stood at the front and said, I cannot believe that you guys have said the things that you said. I thought we were in this together, and you think, so what they concluded from that was actually you never be honest. And so I think fascinating things, but the point about the continuous, so it shows you again that, that the intent and the behavior that follows and the leadership sort of behavior needs to absolutely sort of tie together to be meaningful. I think it all comes back to this point, right? Do I care enough? Do I understand that if my people have, are feeling better about the world, if they are confident in the organization, if they trust in us, if they believe in where we're going, then, will they do better work? The answer to that is unequivocally yes. If I have a voice, am I more likely to feel those things? Absolutely. If you listen to me, if you give me a voice and still ignore it, then no. But I tell you the other thing, and it's just sort of tying into the point. There's a CEO that we work with, and he is a character that I would say is a sublime talent for. I spend time with him and I come away sort of energized and inspired. Just got that energy about them that is just makes you want to do stuff, right? And uplift you. It's a remarkable capability. When he speaks in front of his organization, a big company, right? But when he speaks in front of his organization, the dial moves. So again, you think about this. So I think we often lose sight of the impact that leadership can have on morale. It's been used throughout history. The idea of morale boosting speeches and behaviors that in order to lift us through challenging periods and that sort of stuff. But when you stand in front of people and you are able to articulate things in a way that inspires other people to want to come on this journey with you, that's leadership, right? That's it. And you'll watch, in our data, you'll watch the dial move, and I think it's brilliant to see. I love that because it demonstrates to me the importance of leadership, showing up, being present, being visible, but doing the thing that we always read about. How do I motivate others? How do I inspire others? Well, actually doing it works, right?
Well, it's also trusting people to but it's also, there are so many stuff, like you get misinformation, you have the internet, like you are bombarded with information and you have to sort them all out self. And then you have something at work and you have a mission, but then you have people who are, they, some people just say, okay, you are going to build a house, and then somebody says, yes, I have my hammer and I have a nail, let's do it. And then there is somebody who says, yes, I have to build a house, yeah, I want to read 3 books before I start. We are all on a different scale, and people, because it's also the, like, it, listening can reduce misunderstanding, because you, the conflicts, right? Like, because we can be 10 people in the same room and we probably will get 10 versions of what there was said in that room.
Yep.
Isn't it? Because we listen in our own way.
Yeah. And that, and again, it's part of, I mean, you're absolutely right. What we experience, what we understand, what we hear. It's the same. This is ever the case, isn't it? The idea that we don't all understand the same things. So that's when we. This part of that. This is why we talk a lot about making sense of things, right? Sense making, because if we are able to get some of those assumptions, some of those ideas, some of those misheld views out in the open, but they don't have to be, right? So it's very easy, so the way the social media works, creates, what you watch on Twitter is, I believe this, and then, well, you're an idiot, right? And you watch the sort of the tribes form and fighting stuff. But actually, when you think about that inside an organization, well, actually, we have an opportunity here. It's not two camps trying to fight each other or anything else. We have an opportunity to form a clearer version of the truth, a clearer version of reality. And if truth is too big a word, but so what is it that we really want? And I think that's a fascinating thing in itself. If I understand the assumptions, the beliefs, the images that people have in their head about the type of house I'm trying to build, and what we need to do that, and where we are right now in order to, what's our capability and what are our gaps, and and so when you were describing the idea of grabbing a hammer and a nail, well, it's that old adage, isn't it? If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And and I think the idea often is, organizations are trying to go faster and faster and faster all the time. And as we talk about sprint and agile and all those sorts of ideas, but adaptability, which is really the key thing to organizational longevity, I suspect, is really about helping people to make sense of their environment. And of course, if I'm in a leadership position, I need to understand what everybody else understands. If we could only harness what we know, and I'm trying to think, there was a famous CEO of an organization said, if this organization could only understand what this organization knows, then we'd go a long way, And I think it's in that space, right? We're trying to sort of play to. That's where listening becomes really valuable, because all of us opening our ears and giving everybody an outlet, and of course insights into leadership, and somehow out of all of that stuff we're able to make sense of our environment and therefore go better and go faster or further.
But you also have to think maybe about the empathy, like you are building something like where people are compassionate about, the company, the drive, and like you have a relationship in the company, within the company, and that's how you maybe move forward.
Yeah.
But and if you don't listen, then you start, because because Rab mentioned the people want to be seen at work. They don't want to be. Nobody wants to be a robot. Like, you don't want to be perceived as a robot. You just, well, if you work in a car factory when Henry Ford started it, then you were maybe a robot. You were just to work, shut up, and go home. Like, that was the thing. But now, as you have been mentioning, it's more complex. But you have an education. You are hired because you have some capabilities. You want to be seen. You want to be valued, and you want to make an opinion, and you don't want to be afraid of expressing that opinion.
Yeah.
So you have to have leaders have to take it all in, and because that's why I asked you about the listening and telling, like how that would be together, working together, because it's equally important that we know how to express ourselves. I would not go up to you and say, "Oh, David, that idea you sent with an email yesterday, it's rubbish. It's just ridiculous."
Yeah.
And then probably you should be right to fire me if I was your employee, or just, okay, you will go to the mailroom now, or whatever. So it is this thing about relationships, and like, because as you were saying, we don't go to the pub anymore together, or like, we are so the belonging starts maybe with listening.
Yeah. Yeah, well, feeling heard for sure, and I think that's sort of crucial in that. But having a voice matters, doesn't it? Feeling like you care about me, that you're not
Yeah.
dismissing everything that I say out of hand, And I think there's a big fear, isn't there, about particularly, so anonymity is what it is, right? So I've expressed already the importance of that, but that comes with a price. And that price is the fear or the risk associated with what people might say if they said it without any risk of penalty or censure, right? Um, the the reality is most people, the vast majority of people, understand that at work. You behave appropriately with your colleagues, but what happens when people do stray into a line and they start maybe lashing out? They take the opportunity protected by anonymity to lash out at the organization or to lash out at colleagues. And I don't mean in a very personal way, but you start to talk about, well, I've just been to a bloody meeting and everybody was late and they didn't do their bit and it was a rubbish presentation and those sorts of things. Well, there's some interesting information hidden in that, I think. Sometimes we have to look beyond what's said and understand why it was said, right? And the behavior that we worry about typically comes out when people are feeling insignificant, diminished, ignored, uncared for, fearful. So stuff going on for them, but actually there's an opportunity, isn't there, to lean into care and to remind everybody that actually, do you know what, difficult thing to read, maybe we could have phrased that differently, but I suspect what most people need at that point is an understanding, some support and kindness. And I think that's, and it is fascinating to me how behavior and morale, these 2 points that I've touched on already, the voice alongside morale, how they mirror each other as well. So when organizations inadvertently or even maybe consciously sort of knock the stuffing out of us for a while because of the amount they're putting on us and the strain that we're feeling, then you find yourself then actually maybe confronting some behaviors in voice that's can be challenging. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to it. We should look at why are we getting those things? And then sorry, you were going to say something, Hadim. I'm going to read that comment. Also makes it easy to ignore. Of course, people say these things we don't know it is.
I'm not quite. I will not agree with this, Rap, because sometimes you need to listen, and it's just, that it is when you are anonymous, but then you can maybe do stuff, isn't it? Like, okay, in your experience, David, with your platform, which we have, like you have been mentioning your company, but we are not, like, we were more talking about listening. But when you express yourself in a, like you say, in this meeting this morning, I got really anxious because was it a misunderstanding? And if then you can show that there were more fellow employees who were experiencing the same sense of like lack of understanding or whatever.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think that it comes back to so you're absolutely right. We're not. I'm sort of talking about the way our tool works, I guess, for emphasis of how some of these things can work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what? But the fact is, you come back to that idea of how we all experience things, which is different and unique, and we all come away with a different sense of where we were. And but the ability to have some of those conversations can help us to sort of realign our own thoughts somewhat and create this sort of shared picture of what our reality looks like. And just to sort of sort of follow on to your point to Rab, yeah, look, I mean, I think you made me think with that point, anonymity makes feedback easy to ignore. You know, one of the things that I come across very often, it's tied very closely to the idea of psychological safety, is that we want to be the sort of organization. This is not me speaking. This is paraphrasing other people. But we want to be the sort of organization where people are prepared to put their names or their sort of to own their own feedback. We're open. My door is always open. I'm here, and nothing you can't ask me, nothing you can't say to me. And it sort of leans into this idea that psychological safety is somehow in the gift of leadership to give others. Right? There's so much stuff that everybody brings, their unique experience, their sort of background context. And as I mentioned earlier on, the things that stop us from speaking are far broader than psychological safety alone. So there is the need, I think, just to accept that position means you won't hear everything you should. What you do hear is probably watered down to make it safer for you to hear it. And so that the idea then that we're only prepared to accept feedback based, and if I can see who it comes from, well, that probably goes right back to the sort of bias that I referred to earlier on. If I need to validate where it's coming from, because that somehow makes sense of it. So it's David again, and David's always moaning. I'm taking that feedback with a degree of something already, rather than so we're wrapping up too many things in the messenger and not enough in the message itself. And I think the most important thing, and anybody who's ever had a marginalized voice, whether that's through position or some other reason, the fear of risk, the ability to have conversations based upon the merit of the idea or the conversation or the issue or the thing, what's being said is more important than who is saying it, right? For sure. And I would argue that further than that, why it was said is arguably more important than what was said as well.
That is, I think also that of course there is always the people, like you will always find the moaning, like the people who they live criticizing and stuff, but sometimes there comes inside of these complaints, there is a gold nugget where you have to like take the weed out, and then you see, oh, I didn't realize, oh, is this a problem? Or whatever, like you have to see it as it is. And of course we are not all of us wanting to get critique, but when you are maybe a leader, and as you know, you have your own company and you have your people, like you have your employees, and you have to, like, people have to, I think people can walk up to you, David, and say, David, you're an idiot. And then you ask, oh, why am I an idiot? Like, then you can have a discussion, and like, but in the end, you are the owner, and you can say, like, yeah, but I feel strongly about this, but I can sense where you're taking me, or taking this subject.
Yeah, and the but look, I understand enough about A, myself, and B, the realities of any social structure. If I pay your wages, you will be careful what you say to me.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter how open and honest and all that sort of stuff, and you could call me an idiot, all those sort of things. The reality is I'm only hearing some things, and I know that. Right? And people will worry about how I react to things, and there's nothing I can do about that. So all you can do is keep focusing on, okay, well, what can we control? And that, so right, to wrap this up, because I'm conscious that we're up on time, but when we think about the listening piece, if we understand just that last piece that I've said, and you say, well, so now I need to think, how do I compensate for the fact I'm not hearing the truth? Because the only thing I can work with, if I don't really understand that some of my team are struggling, really struggling, and it doesn't have to, maybe they're not telling me for personal reasons, then how can I engage with them in a way that is respectful to what they need and all that sort of stuff? It's just complex. So none of this stuff is easy. Right?
No.
I have a great deal of sympathy with people in leadership roles who, trying to do the right thing, and it's very, very, it's very difficult because the larger organizations are complex and challenging.
Yeah. But I think we could sum it up as like listening is like maybe hard, but the benefits it brings to your relationships, knowledge, and overall communication make it well worth the effort. So but my last question, because time flies when you're having fun, David.
Yep.
Are you a good listener?
That's a really good question. Look, I try to be.
Yeah.
I try to be. But I'm also a human being, and I'm susceptible to the things that if you get me talking about something, and you've probably seen me do this today, right? Your energy goes up, right? So I thrive off energy with other people. Dialogue brings out lots of ideas and excitement, and so you could be talking about something, and I suddenly find myself, I find myself sort of chomping at the bit to say, or I'll speak a fraction too early because my brain's whirring away, and I'm always deeply admiring those people. I've got some really good friends who do this, and you can start talking, and they will just sit and listen, and they'll wait until I finish, and they'll be sure I finish, and then they'll respond. Whereas meanwhile, I'll wait until they're 3/4 of the way through their sentence, and I'm back at it again. So there's they are. So to the point, I try to be a good listener, but I think the most important thing, and again, it comes back to the obsession that we all have with listening individually, is one skill. So will I shut up and listen when things really matter and it's important? Yes, but I think the second thing is actually when it comes to to listening at scale, to listening to organizations and the way that they function, that's a slightly different thing. And that's a different desire, it's a different need, it's a different want from leadership to say, I want better information, I want better connection and collaboration, I want to build trust, I want my people to be able to help me move this organization forward. That's a slightly different thing, and that I think about all the time. So
yeah. Well, as you have mentioned Harken, and it's like the name Harken is because you had the happiness lab, but then you wanted to change, and Harken is, as I recall, an old English word for listening, isn't it?
to listen attentively.
Yes.
English, Swedish, and Danish share the same word. Hearken, to listen attentively.
Okay.
There you go. So.
And I lived in Denmark for 8 years, and I never heard it. But
listen. But most people here recognize hark only from Hark the Herald Angels Sing.
Yeah.
Very sort of timely thing this time of year. But it's an old English word, but to listen attentively far more closely fits what we're about, and love it. It's good. It's a good name.
And I will tell people, because I have followed you, we have become friends for we have met and everything, because it's funny how COVID made this happen. But the platform is brilliant, and I think that people should just check it out, and because we never intended this conversation to be a sales pitch for Harken, but like if people are interested, then they should definitely check it out, because it is interesting and it is valuable. And there are loads of stories where you have been telling about where people have expressed something and you can go in and say, how can we help you? Like, what is happening? Why are you feeling this way? And you are doing it anonym, like this was me talking anonymously.
Yeah, I think that I still think we're only scratching the surface in terms of what, when you really unlock voice inside organizations and you unlock an organization's capacity to listen, then what could we do with that? That's that, because we started, with the idea of, can we get people to speak? And then we're thinking, okay, well, how do we make more use of that? And how do we get the organization to listen differently? And what structures do we need to build inside organizations to help them act on the things that they hear in a way that makes a difference to people's lives inside the company? There's a whole circle of things. But I think it's, it's very kind of you to say that you like the platform. I'm really proud of what we've done. And yeah, as I said, we've quite a journey ahead, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So David, I just, as always, I somehow love you because I talk to you every now and then again. So, but just a reminder for the next conversation. I can't write conversation, like somehow I always skip a beat or conversation or whatever. Like my mind is tricky. So the next time will be with Hanson Hunt. He is from the US, and we will talk about stuff that is also fun, because I am so curious that I love listening and talking to people. And I hope that you had fun talking to me, as always, David.
Yeah, but it's been a great conversation, and thank you. The next one looks awesome too, so I shall be back for that.
Oh yes. So, and our true follower, Rab Bessie, who will be a guest on the show, by the way, but in the new year. So, nails on a blackboard. Yeah. Okay. Listen to me. That would be horrible. But thank you very much, David, and thank you. You always seem to have a time. Like it's so good to have people who care, isn't it? It's just, we need people who care, who listen, and just are there for you, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly right. Really important.
And have a happy holiday,
Oh yeah,
mate.
to you.
Mate, now we are getting closer. So thank you very much for following. Greetings to Bangladesh and everywhere. So just thank you, everybody.